Welcome to the Filmlings Podcast,
a weekly podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is week 45, Happy Henson.
And please welcome to the show our Jim Henson expert extraordinaire, Hayden Chauffe.
Hey, how's it going, guys? Thank you so much for having me back on again.
Yeah, welcome back to the show, Hayden, our first return guest.
Yeah, so Hayden joined us way back at the beginning of the podcast to talk about Hayao Miyazaki and some Japanese animation. And today we're talking about a different kind of fabricated characters from America, and that is Muppets and Creatures, designed by Jim Henson.
Yeah, and we are
so excited.
We are very excited to have Hayden on the show with us. He is not just a Muppet fan, not just a Jim Henson fan. He is a Muppet fanboy. He loves the Muppets. And Hayden, why don't you tell us how you
Thank you for that understatement, Alex.
Why don't you tell us how you came to love the Muppets so much? Because it's something that Jonathan and I understand. We like the Muppets as well, but it's hard unless someone has met you to fully understand just how much you like the Muppets. How did you come
Alex,
to them?
It all started many days ago when you called me up and asked me to do the podcast, and I looked at the Wikipedia article. Just kidding. I was actually a Muppet fan day one. I kid you not. I was given a Kermit doll the day I was born by my grandmother. And
Stardom young.
Yes, literally, I was a Muppet fan as early as you could possibly be in a life. And by the time I was 5, I had already seen the core 5 Muppet films, which are the Muppet movie, the Great Muppet Caper, which we'll be talking about today, the Muppets Take Manhattan, and then the 2 that were made after Jim Henson's death, the Muppet Christmas Carol and Muppet Treasure Island. Of course, I was 5, and there are many Muppet movies to come after that. But I was just a Muppet nut. By the time I was 7, I had received a book from my aunt called Jim Henson: The Works, which basically detailed all of his work throughout his amazing career. And gosh, I mean, the reason I didn't grow out of the Muppets was I always found a reason to come back. I was intrigued with these simplistic kind of really idealistic kind of characters when I was young. You know, it was like, it's the same reason you like colorful things when you're kids. But then as I grew up, I found how deep and how sophisticated the characters are. And, it's like, I think Frank Oz put it best when it's really like an O'Neill play, where these characters are kind of tugging at each other's heartstrings, and everyone has an opinion about each of the characters, and just the complexity of these really simple characters is astonishing, and the humor is always on point, and it's Jim Henson was my first influence as an artist, point blank. And I'm just so excited to talk to you guys today about how much I love this artist and the work that he's done as a director and a creator and as a human being, honestly.
Yeah, and we're certainly excited to have somebody who spent literally a lifetime, studying Jim Henson on the show to back up our discussion, because we've seen these films before, some of them, but we really only have dived into the study of what Jim Henson is all about as a creator, both Muppets and beyond the Muppets, this week, as we tend to do on this podcast. So let's talk a little bit about Jim Henson, the man, a Muppet of a man. He was born...
Very manly Muppet.
A very manly Muppet. He was born in 1936 in Mississippi, and he would bounce between Mississippi and Maryland as a kid growing up, eventually graduating from high school in Maryland, and a lot of his work, his early work, was based in the East Coast, on the East Coast. He started working in TV in high school, and it was his first position. Correct me if I'm wrong here, Hayden, but it was as a puppet.
Right.
He was a puppeteer. The show actually that he joined was canned because of child labor laws, but he did start as a puppet performer on TV in high school.
That's correct. And his very first thing that he did, he started off. He was really he did a lot of cartooning as a high schooler, and he designed theater sets and things like that. He was very much a theater kid, and the thing that Jim Henson was so interested in above anything else was television. He was obsessed with the idea of television, learning how it worked. He wanted to be on television. That was his goal. And so essentially what happened was there was an ad listing for a puppeteer, and he had never even considered being a puppeteer before, but it was so important to him to get on television that he checked a book out of the library, taught himself how to make puppets, made a puppet, and basically got the ball rolling from there.
Yeah, and then from
was
there...
Was that Kermit, or was that a different character?
It was Pierre the French Rat.
Yes, it was Pierre the French Rat. He made Kermit as his grandfather was dying, I believe, out of his mother's felt coat.
And that's a hugely famous story. The whole idea of taking his mother's coat, her green coat, and then cutting it up and making some ping pong ball eyes.
Which, by the way, I love Kermit. I love the color of Kermit. I love the color of Kermit as a puppet. The color of Kermit as a coat is horrendous.
Well, it was actually it was a different shade of green than the one we're familiar with. In fact, Kermit wasn't even really a frog at this time. He was a character on
Sam and Friends, which is the
yes.
first big success that Jim Henson is a part of. It is a show that airs. It's not a very long show. It's like a 5-minute show that would air between other shows, typically like a news show, and it would bounce around time slots. In
it
the
was
Washington,
basically
D.C. area.
It would run before the news. It was a very local thing, but it was hugely successful in the Washington area.
Yeah, and it was essentially, our main character of the show was Sam, who was a human, and the other characters, according to Jim Henson, were figments of Sam's imagination or expressions of his psyche, who would do crazy things around him, and one of those characters was Kermit, but at that point, Kermit wasn't really a frog. He was just kind of like
Kermit the Thing.
He was just a thing, yeah.
Basically, what they would do on Sam and Friends is... the most popular thing they would do like little comedy sketches. They would do lip syncs of music. So from the get-go, Henson was always about music, comedy, and people were just intrigued. Two things that Henson made serious innovations in during this time was puppets. Up to that point, they would always work behind a proscenium stage, like a theater. And Henson, being so interested in television, saw really the TV frame as the proscenium. So basically, he was wise enough to realize that everything that the television saw was the universe that the characters existed in. So they could hide behind the frame of the television and convey things that had never been done before in puppetry. And also another huge innovation that happened during that time was the fact that they would watch the performances through a monitor, a reverse image of what they were seeing. So basically they were also the audience as well. So they could dictate what they were doing with absolute precision and really pander to what the audience was seeing.
And of course, during Sam and Friends is when Jim Henson first creates the Muppet Company. And he creates it with his co-performer / future wife, Jane Henson. They would have a very long, tumultuous relationship as husband and wife, but they would remain close friends throughout it all. And he would go on to start doing commercial work with his Muppets, including the famous Wilkins and Wokins coffee commercials that played all over the place. Oh my
gosh. And they did the meat commercials as well.
Yeah. And he would make regular appearances on variety shows such as The Jimmy Dean Show. So you'd have a variety show, you'd have a host, they do a bunch of stuff, and one of the segments would be the Muppets. And these puppets would come out and they would start to gain a reputation, a certain knowing around the country for those performances.
Yeah, The Jimmy Dean Show was definitely the first massive exposure that Henson got. Specifically, he introduced the character of Ralph, and he would kind of play this sidekick role to Jimmy Dean. And you should definitely YouTube it if you get a chance. And just to jump back, the commercials with Wilkins and Wilkins, they're like these 5-second commercials that are absolutely hilarious. And there's like over 100 of them on YouTube. And they're just these 5-minute things where it's like kind of almost this dark, macabre humor where it's like, oh, hey, what do you think about Wilkins coffee? And then there would be a positive character in Wilkins who loved the coffee, and Wontkins, who was kind of this, who couldn't stand the coffee. He'd be like, oh, I don't like Wilkins coffee. And then like Wilkins would do something to him, like he would shoot him with a cannon or...
I saw one where he turned the airplane upside down and dropped him out of it.
And there was always like some great puns, like, hey, if you don't like Wilkins coffee, Mr. Wilkins will put his foot down, and then literally a foot would come from the heavens and stomp Wontkins. Just some really amazing early Muppet humor.
A lot of the humor I noticed this week is very kind of akin to Monty Python and British humor. And I know the Muppet Show actually was produced in England, but just it seems to be very akin to Jim Henson's style of comedy.
Absolutely. And they worked a lot with what we'll cover in one of the films, The Labyrinth. Terry Jones actually redid the screenplay for them to kind of add some of the humor that the Labyrinth has.
Yeah, he was one of the many cooks in that kitchen.
There were too many cooks, to quote a famous Adult Swim video.
That also includes some interesting puppets.
Yeah, the oh my gosh. The influence of Henson has spread to the corners of the world, no doubt.
Yeah. But he continues his work in commercials, and during this time he starts to, from a biographical perspective, he's starting to grow his family, he's starting to grow his business, he recruits more members of the team, including Frank Oz,
oh my gosh,
and Jerry Jewell, and a bunch of these bigger names who become part of the team. And during this time, he starts to do experimental film work, which I didn't know before this week. And a lot of
Timepiece.
Really weird, including Timepiece, which was nominated for an Oscar, actually, in the short film category. And he also did a really weird, interesting television movie special called The Cube, which is about a guy stuck in a cube. It's like a really weird sci-fi piece. But it's interesting because you think of this guy who is famous for Muppets, and he's doing all these other things. And a big theme we're going to talk about today is that he is an experimental artist, and just one of the venues that he found to express himself through were the Muppets. But there was so much more to him than just the Muppets. And a big part of his career is a strive to identify himself in the popular imagination as not just a Muppeteer, which is a word he did not like. He preferred to be called a Muppet performer, or a puppet performer, but to identify as not just a Muppet, the Muppet guy, but as an artist in his own right. But eventually, he is drawn into a new venture by a kids' TV program, commonly known nowadays as Sesame Street.
That's right, the Children's Television Workshop.
Yeah, and he develops him and his team develop the Muppets for the show, the puppets for the show, such as Bert and Ernie, which are Jim Henson and Frank Oz, and Big Bird, who is played by the great Carol Spinney for many
and Oscar
years.
the Grouch, also played by Carol Spinney.
Oscar the Grouch,
which is always so interesting to me because you literally have the antithesis of innocence and like this.
Talk about
just
range.
Grumpy.
Yeah.
New York taxi driver.
Yeah.
All the Muppet performers do multiple characters, and they're often quite contrasting characters. So it's really interesting to watch.
Yeah. And the Muppets were not originally intended to be a huge part of Sesame Street, but as we know nowadays, they kind of just took over the show.
It's not even called. Children's Television Workshop anymore. It's just called Sesame Workshop.
Yeah.
And it's, I mean, just the puppets. I mean, the Muppets, I should say. They are legally called Muppets still, even though Disney owns the rights. That was part of the contract, that the Sesame Street Muppets remain known as Muppets.
Yeah. Oh gosh.
Now we'll get into that. How now it's owned by 3 companies. You know, like the Henson Company with Fraggle Rock and the Dark Crystal, and then Disney owning the core Muppet Show Muppets, and Sesame Workshop owning the Sesame Street.
Yeah. It ended up being quite the hodgepodge towards the end of that developed towards the end of Jim Henson's life and right after it, because he died. He died early, and we'll get to that in just a second. But we do have to mention that there was a brief stint on SNL during the very first season. They were part of SNL. The SNL performers hated them. They did not like the Muppets, and the Muppets felt very out of place on the show. And but thankfully, it didn't have to last too long, because right at the end of the first season of SNL, Jim Henson gets The Muppet Show in Britain, thanks to the British TV legend Lou Lord, who agreed to take on the show as part of like this kind of new thing at the time, syndicated television, where you basically make a show and then sell it to channels to fill in slots instead of selling it to a network. And they produced it in Britain, and it becomes huge. It becomes a big deal. I just realized how I said huge, and I feel really bad about that. Please apologize.
Easy,
I'm sorry.
Donald Trump.
But seriously, it is a huge deal. It is the #1 show in the world. Everyone loves The Muppet Show, and it runs for 5 years. And towards the end of that, they released their first movie, The Muppet Movie. And from there...
And if I could just get into the importance...
please do.
...of The Muppet Show, and how...
That's why you're here, Hayden.
That's very true. This is where they solidified some of the characters that everyone knows and loves. You know, Electric Mayhem and Animal, Scooter, Fozzie Bear, the Great Gonzo, Miss Piggy, as well as the core Muppet performers, Dave Goelz, Steve Whitmire, Jerry Nelson, Richard Hutt, and I mean, along with Jim Henson performing several of the characters as well. And these performers really kind of unite into this family that almost like the ultimate improv team. They work off of each other super well. And it allows for these characters to grow in really complex relationships, because they basically have this playground where they can experiment. And that's what the great thing about the Muppet Show. It was kind of this variety show where, you know, you have Kermit as the MC, and he's hosting all of these really weird and interesting variety acts. Like Fozzie Bear is the comic, Gonzo is like this artist, Piggy is the diva. And along with that, they have like these really experimental kind of, you know, probably the best one people know is like Phenomena, where it's just like this.
Yeah. Phenomena. If you didn't know, there you go.
And these characters are never used in any other situation but that one song.
Yeah. And each show would have a celebrity guest host. And at first, the television producer who put them on, Lou Lord, had to call in a bunch of favors to get them on. But as the Muppet Show blows up halfway through the first season...
people were banging down the doors to get on this show.
Yeah, people were dying to get on this show.
They had no problems. I mean, huge names. Julie Andrews, Steve Martin, Don DeLuise.
I'm really excited to maybe Wednesday get to see the Gene Kelly episode.
Oh my gosh.
It's like one of the very last episodes. Unfortunately, a lot of the Muppet Show isn't available at the moment due to some weird copyright things.
Yeah. So the first 3 seasons are available on DVD, but a lot of it is cut out because they weren't able to get the rights to some of the songs that they sing. Because it was this variety show format, there was a lot of use of copywritten songs. And So much so in the 4th and 5th season that they haven't even been able to release them yet. But they continue to reassure us that they're coming. Although that was like 10 years ago.
Yeah. Sure thing, Disney. But yeah, remember, this is a very different time. This isn't coming out on Netflix or a time where every single episode that comes out of a TV show is available online within a week or two after it airing. It airs, it's done. It might come back in syndication at some point, but it's not. What are you going to do if you see a copyrighted song on the air? And they were very much in the mindset of, let's just do it and ask forgiveness later. And plus, it was the Muppet Show. Everyone wanted their stuff up there. But yeah, this is where a lot of these puppets who had kind of existed through the commercial work of Jim Henson and his company, which eventually became called Henson Associates, or Ha. He named a bunch of his departments like stuff that would sound funny. So like one of them was called He, one of them was called Ho, one of them was called Ha. When you have a name that starts with an H, you've got a lot of options.
It's a good thing my name is Hayden.
Yeah. I was thinking you were very fortunate in that regard. But yeah, all of these characters who had been developed over the years, like Rolf and Kermit, who eventually became a frog after he appeared in one of the short films Jim Henson made as a troubadour with a collar on. And once he was wearing the collar, everyone was like, oh, it's a frog.
The Frog Prince. Actually, was it the Frog Prince?
No, it was...
Because that was the first time he was mentioned as a frog.
It was, what is it? It was the first one where he was telling a fairy tale.
Tales of Tinker D?
Tales of Tinker D, that's it. And he's like a narrator in between scenes, and he's like a troubadour, and he's playing his lyre or his harp or whatever, but he's wearing a collar.
It was a little lyre, I believe.
Yeah, and it just... Once you wear that collar, which, by the way, frogs don't actually have collars. I don't know where this is coming from other than Kermit. But for some reason, once he's wearing the collar, he just looks like a frog. And ever since then, he was a frog. And it just worked, and he became like the number one character associated with Jim Henson. A lot of people would say it's because he's very much like Jim Henson. But the Muppet Show is where all of these relationships are coalesced into this big cast that everyone knows and loves as the Muppets. And of course, when we talk about the Muppet Company or the Muppet Studios or the Muppet Workshop, whatever it's called now, we're talking about the whole wide range of Muppets and creatures that are created there. But when you say the Muppets, people think about the cast from the Muppet Show. And of course, the 3 films we'll be talking about today, only one of them will involve the Muppets, the Great Muppet Caper from 1981, but the other 2 certainly wouldn't be around without the Muppets. And those are The Dark Crystal from 1982 and Labyrinth from 1986. And those 2 have puppets. The Dark Crystal's all puppets. Labyrinth is mostly puppets along with David Bowie.
So mostly puppets.
It's interesting that we chose these 3 films because they're actually the only 3 theatrical films that Jim Henson directed. He did a lot of television, a lot of made-for-TV films, both before and after this time period, like immense amounts of work.
Yeah,
these are the only 4
So this may be the first time since Shane Carruth that we're looking at a director's entire feature film career.
Correct.
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, I would have to say that every single Muppet movie is a Jim Henson movie. Even though he's dead now, I would say every Muppet movie is, in a way, a Jim Henson movie.
I can agree with that.
We're talking about his whole directorial canon, certainly, but I wouldn't say we're talking about his whole thing. He was a very hard artist to pin into one thing. The second he had accomplished something, he would be interested in something else. So, that's one of the reasons The Muppet Show only ran for 5 seasons. He was interested in doing something else. And also, I really have to respect this, he didn't want it to get stale. He wanted to go out on a high note. He didn't want it to drag to like 12, 14, 15 seasons like some shows do nowadays.
He was always the next thing. Always
the next thing.
How can we make something better? How can we do something that no one has ever done before? The result is some really interesting and kind of mind-trippy films, if we're being honest.
Yeah. But that's how we ended up with Muppets in the mainstream movie industry. Because you wouldn't have them without Jim Henson. They definitely wouldn't be there. Outside of like weird, creepy ventriloquist dolls and horror films. So let's talk about our movies for today. And The Great Muppet Caper is up first, and I can think of no one better to introduce this one than Hayden. And Hayden, do you want to tell us what the plot of this movie is all about?
Oh my gosh, The Great Muppet Caper. Well, I mean, it's the plot ultimately is not very important. I will tell everyone what the plot is, but really the Great Muppet Caper is, hey, it's important to know what the first Muppet movie was to kind of appreciate the Great Muppet Caper on a certain level, which is basically the Muppets in the original movie unite together, go to Hollywood and decide to start a career in making films and making people happy.
They get the standard rich and famous contract from a cameo Orson Welles, and that is just one of my favorite moments ever in film. It's so
the character is named Lou Lord in tribute to Lou Lord, who gave them their start.
Gosh, if anyone was going to give me a standard rich and famous contract, I would want it to be Orson Welles. But
right.
Yes.
But anyway.
Yes. So really what the Great Muppet Caper is all about is, hey, here are the Muppets. Specifically, we're introduced to Kermit, Fozzie, and Gonzo in a hot air balloon. And, hey, we're going to make a movie. And aren't movies just great? That's essentially what the opening song is, Hey, a Movie, which is all about how aren't movies just the best thing ever? And we're going to make a movie, and hey, we're going to give you a really quick exposition, and we're going to be aware of it. This is probably one of the most self-aware, fourth wall breaking meta movies ever created.
From the moment that Animal stands in for like the MGM lion and eats the little
literally eats the border away. But essentially what the plot is there's this fashion designer, Lady Holiday, who basically she has this famous jewel, the baseball diamond, and her brother, her nefarious brother.
Holy crap, I just got that.
Yes.
Oh, I was expecting it to look like a baseball the entire movie. Anyway, continue.
But her nefarious brother, Nicky, both of these played by human actors, by the way. It's a Muppet movie. You came to see the Muppets, although there are a lot of great cameos in it. Basically, the Muppets, specifically Kermit and Fozzie, are playing twin investigative reporters for the Daily Chronicle. So there's a whole running gag throughout the film that Kermit and Fozzie are identical twins. And the amazing part of it is literally there are so many moments where it's physically acknowledged. People mistake them for
also the fact
that the bear's the one with the hat.
Yeah, yes. That bears, you identify anyone wearing a hat as a bear.
Yes.
Or any Muppet wearing a hat, I guess.
So basically Kermit, Fozzie, and Gonzo arrive in England. And they arrive at the Happiness Hotel, which is this drab, just the saddest hotel you could possibly think of. And it happens to contain, going back to Jonathan's point, how they're second-class citizens, literally every other Muppet.
Only Muppets. There's been, so far, like humans and Muppets interacting, but this hotel, which is the only free hotel, is only Muppets.
So this goes kind of back to our other point, how because the Muppets are such established characters, they can get away with introducing like almost the rest of the cast, minus Miss Piggy, who will be introduced in a little bit, almost immediately within the context of the Happiness Hotel song. So this is where we get Scooter, Ralph, Electric Mayhem, Pops, and they're all kind of introduced through this song. And the next day, they arrive at Lady Holiday's, I guess it's her studio to interview her. She has like an office. And before they get there, Miss Piggy arrives, and she has the goal of becoming a fashion model. And basically Lady Holiday gives her a job as a secretary. And there's this that triggers this whole mix-up plot where Lady Holiday goes off and does stuff, and then Kermit arrives to interview her, and then Miss Piggy has disguised herself as Lady Holiday because she falls in love with Kermit instantly. Eventually, they go out on a date together, and it's revealed that Piggy was actually disguising herself as Lady Holiday, and then it leads to an amazing scene where Kermit essentially finds a glass slipper. Yes, they do the glass slipper cliche. And then there's this whole ridiculous scene where essentially this guy down on his luck meets Kermit on a bench, and he claims to know Kermit's story, and it's just this absurd moment.
That's a cameo, isn't it? I'm not sure who it is, but there are several cameos that I knew, like I was supposed to know if I knew the culture around the time the movie came out. Because there's literally one guy who says that he is a cameo.
Yes. And a lot of huge names at the time in England, too. A lot of English actors make their cameos. From Monty Python, we have, what's his name? John Cleese, who has an amazing scene where Piggy basically lies about her address, Highbrow Street, and it actually ends up being an actual street. It's occupied by John Cleese. So much British commentary on British personas, I guess, because they just sit there having the most unemotional dinner, and then as pigs and frogs start running through their house, they're just like, oh, okay. Just so nonchalantly acknowledge it. That's actually something that the Muppets do extraordinarily well, because if you think about it in terms of movie by movie, the first Muppet movie is kind of this commentary on American culture, and then the Great Muppet Caper is a commentary on British culture, and then Muppets Take Manhattan, well, that's a commentary on Portugal culture. But anyway, basically, the Muppets get into this giant fiasco where the brother of the fashion designer, Nikki Holiday, he's going to steal her most prized possession, the baseball diamond, and they vow to stop her. He frames Miss Piggy, and there's this giant water fantasy sequence that's insane that took... Basically, Frank Oz spent a week in underwater to film this scene, and it's ridiculous, and there were like 18 trained water dancers. And just how this movie interrupts itself constantly with these ridiculous dance and tributes to film. Once again, the Great Muppet Caper, all about isn't film great, and look at all these things we can do with puppets. And there's scenes where they're riding bicycles, and basically, you know, of course the Muppets are going to save the day at the end of the day. But gosh,
a lot of it is Jim Henson showing off, essentially, isn't it? Especially after the first film, which was not directed by Jim Henson, but people were super impressed. And Jim Henson was like, these things are easy. Let me show you what's hard. And then he just pulls off the most incredible sequences with puppets and incorporates them seamlessly into these scenes where you can't see the performers, you can't see the wires or anything, and he just makes you believe that they are performers as much as the human characters.
Just your suspension of disbelief is, for these characters, you're almost astonished because, I mean, there's a part of you that knows, okay, they're puppets and they're being performed by puppeteers, but you really do invest in these characters, which is one of the huge appeals of the Muppets. They're like actors, pretty much. And you almost form a relationship with them as real beings. Because they are real. They're the things that you're seeing, everything has happened. And kind of going off of another point that you were making, Jonathan, about how Jim Henson kind of raised the stakes. In the original Muppet movie, the big deal was, oh my gosh, Kermit was riding a bicycle. Everyone couldn't stop talking about this. And Jim Henson was like, oh, well, that was easy. We just used a crane and a marionette puppet. So what they did for the sequel is they literally pulled off this super complex scene with Kermit and Piggy riding bicycles. And at the end, literally every single Muppet character is on bicycles.
Yeah, from these huge crane angles where there's no like place to hide puppeteers very easily.
And one of the ways that they pulled that off is essentially like 50 feet in the distance, they had people essentially carrying them. And, they used a lot of radio-controlled Muppets for kind of the long shots. But then they would switch. Jim Henson was always very good at knowing how to switch the camera work. And they learned a lot of this during the Muppet Show, where like when a character would pick up a telephone, they would switch the angle really quickly so they could essentially glue the telephone to their hand. And it was done so seamlessly that people wouldn't even notice. A lot of the techniques that they would use kind of mirrored that idea from the original Muppet Show, where they would basically for the close-ups, they would be on dollies controlling the actual hand puppets. And in the background, you would see Miss Piggy riding, who was being radio controlled using using a radio controlled puppet and being pulled along by a string. So it was in just the shot. It goes back to this original Jim Henson tenet that the camera really is the universe that these characters inhabit. And as long as you don't see how it's being worked, and it's done in a way that's seamless and believable, we're really willing to suspend our disbelief from what we are seeing on the screen.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting. There was one documentary that I watched called Henson's Place from 1984, and it showed footage before they made the first Muppet movie, when they weren't sure if they were going to be able to take the Muppets out of this proscenium kind of television setting and put them in the real world. And so it was just some really simple shots of Kermit and Fozzie talking to some cows. But literally they just had Jim Henson's hand in Kermit just right off camera. So it's just an over-the-shoulder shot of Kermit talking to these cows.
Yes.
and it worked. It was just their little like 8mm proof of concept. And that kickstarted all these movies.
And if I could chime in, just the ad-libbing between Jim Henson and Frank Oz during that test footage is amazing. So
really
definitely
is.
YouTube it. And that goes back to this whole idea of Frank Oz and Jim Henson just kind of, and we're going to talk about this later in The Dark Crystal, where they literally collaborate as directors together and kind of how they complement each other really well. But these are the guys who brought us Ernie and Bert, Kermit and Miss Piggy, Kermit and Fozzie. Just so many of the core relationships in the Muppets are based around this comedy duo that we never see, but they work off of each other so well. And they flip personalities so well too. I mean, you think of the relationship between Kermit and Fozzie, where, Kermit's kind of the straight man and Fozzie's like this really insecure comedian. And then they can flip it on a dime with Ernie and Bert, where Bert is like this really stiff kind of boring person, if I'm being honest. I mean, he's like, he relishes in his boringness. And then Ernie is kind of, joy incarnate.
So we should talk about the way that the improv and the ad-lib on set has led to the development of these character relationships that we love so much. Because you guys are right, they would just have fun on set, and especially between Frank Oz and Jim Henson, there was this really strong friendship, this really strong comedy duo going on, where they would just ad-lib on set. And there's multiple stories about how some of the key characters really emerged through people just doing odd, strange things on set, and suddenly it works. Like when Gonzo suddenly is pushed to the brink. I think he was making him do take after take after take, the performer who does Gonzo.
Yes, Dave Goles.
And eventually he broke and he went, no, like Gonzo does. and suddenly there was a character.
So the performer Dave Goelz was actually originally one of the Muppet designers, and he wasn't actually a performer at all. And Jim Henson pulled him in, and basically he gave him a Frackle character that was used in a Christmas special, which was reworked to serve as Gonzo. And Gonzo was during the first season of the Muppet Show, he was very sad-eyed. He was really insecure, and he wasn't really getting a lot of laughs. But like you said, the story that you told allowed Dave Goelz to finally really come into his own with Gonzo, and he even redesigned the puppet for the next season with an eye mechanism where he can basically raise his eyes really wide, which is why Gonzo is such this eccentric, crazy personality. And then Miss Piggy, who was just this female pig puppet that was being tossed around by a lot of different performers. And basically, Frank Oz took her, and what really solidified her character was when she karate chopped Kermit, and she kind of just rose to the ranks. She was literally like a Hollywood success story within the context of the Muppet universe. And it eventually grew so big that it escalated out of the Muppets, and she became like a world star. It's ridiculous. She was on the cover of magazines, everything, but it all...
Yeah, she almost took over the show. And it wasn't even meant to be a karate chop. It was meant to be a slap.
It was, yes. So originally it was just a slap.
And then it was improv'd. And then suddenly, boom, we have this character who is exploding and becoming world famous.
Yeah, and this all goes back to the style of environment that Jim Henson created, which is one that really, he encouraged creative freedom. He encouraged anarchy. He encouraged upstaging. Which is a lot of big no-nos in a lot of different television shows, but he relished in that. He relished in the idea of, let's make each other laugh and our show will be greater for it. And what it allowed them to do was develop these incredibly personal characters, because every character really comes down to a flaw within the puppeteer themselves. And it's really a project. I mean, Kermit is definitely the biggest example of this. Kermit is this projection, this idealistic idea. The creative freedom really allowed for these characters to grow into the superstars that they are today. I mean, everyone knows Kermit the Frog, Miss Piggy, Animal, the Great Gonzo. I mean, these are household names. Even if you're not a Muppet fan, people are familiar with them.
Yeah, and you're talking about how these characters are coming from a place in the performers. And I was watching an interview with Frank Oz talking about playing Miss Piggy, and he was saying that she is his hardest character to do, not only because, the voice can get very grating on his throat just physically, but also because she comes from this very insecure place in himself. So he has to go to this insecure place. He has to feel that place get hurt, and then he has to cover it up with humor. And he's like, that's who Miss Piggy is. She's very insecure, she's hurt, and she tries to cover it with this humor and this persona. And he was like, so that is the most, I guess, psychologically difficult character for him to play. And it's just amazing that he played her so well for so long. And like you were saying, she became this kind of entity apart from, anything else that anyone could have imagined. She just took on this whole life outside of the show and just into popular culture.
Yeah, and we've talked a lot about how great the characters are. We've talked a lot about the technical innovations in puppetry and TV and film style that Jim Henson had worked on to bring this around. But we should talk about the intersection of those, which is the technology of the puppets themselves. And for going all the way back to Sam and Friends, you have to talk about making a soft puppet rather than kind of a hard fixed puppet to give it more expression. And
never been
Jim
done
Henson
before.
is all about expression. He's all about being able to express with the characters. And if you think about the way like Kermit expresses himself, like it's kind of odd. Like the top, like his forehead is like caving in to make expressions, but it works. It works because the puppeteer knows what they're doing. And
if you think about it,
for it.
Kermit is the most simple of all the puppets, and he really is formed to the shape of a hand, but just all the things that you can do with that, and they do it as well.
Yeah, Kermit is basically just a hand puppet.
Like the grimace, and it's such a testament to the effectiveness of some of these simpler puppets. And I mean, once we get into Dark Crystal and Labyrinth, they literally go against that completely, and they form these really complex, intricate, radio-controlled puppets that need like 5 people.
But we should before we move on to those more complicated puppets, we should talk about one of the most foundational things about making a good, not just a puppet, but a Muppet, like something coming out of one of Jim Henson's workshops, is the Henson Triangle. And Hayden, what's the Henson Triangle?
All right, so one thing that you may notice, all of the puppets, they basically have a nose and 2 eyes, and they're aligned in such a way that it's almost like they're slightly cross-eyed. But what this does is it actually registers better on television, so it looks like they're staring directly at you. Some of the first Muppets that he made, they didn't do the cross-eyed thing, and what ended up happening was it gave this disconnect. But by crossing the eyes slightly, it gives the appearance that they're always staring at you. They're always focused, which is a huge part of the Muppet success, is this idea of they can literally look at you. They can look at you dead on. We learned that in theater, where it's the importance of hitting your target and not looking at the audience, but through them, which allows for the audience to register your eyes stronger.
But not totally take you out of the performance.
Correct.
Any weeks where we have vocab words, I'm like, yeah, let's explain those vocab words.
And any weeks that we have references to old episodes. And this week in the Great Muppet Caper, there's, as Hayden was talking about, there are some very elaborate dance sequences. And anyone who is a fan of classic Hollywood, like Jim Henson clearly was, can't do elaborate dance numbers without referencing Busby Berkeley. And the Aqua musicals, like Hayden was saying, there's this super elaborate dance sequence with Miss Piggy underwater. And then there's one in a restaurant area that's a direct reference to Busby Berkeley.
It's a dinner club, Jonathan.
Is it a dinner club? I'm sorry.
Yeah,
that's fine.
I thought it was a supper club.
That was a great setup. Oh, it's a supper. Boy, that was a triple setup right there.
It was a backlot. Can we just?
Yep.
Yeah.
But yeah, that water sequence is straight out of Footlight Parade. I mean, it's modified to accommodate a puppet, and be on a smaller scale. And oh boy, man, did making a waterproof puppet give them fits. That was difficult.
Yeah,
but they're always pushing the technology. Those Muppet people.
That was actually the most difficult scene of the entire film. And a lot of it had to do with communication problems, because they were literally underwater for great deals of that. There was even an instance where Frank Oz almost drowned.
Oh, wow.
Because they got the signals confused. So they sacrificed a lot to make that scene. And like I was saying, they had 18 professional swimmers who all had to line up perfectly and dive into the pool at the right moment. And then, of course, we have waterproof puppets, so they had to construct Miss Piggy out of a completely different type of material so she wouldn't disintegrate, since most of the Muppets are traditionally made out of foam rubber, and occasionally latex, more latex as we get into Dark Crystal. So what they had to do was they had to literally keep the heat at like a really humid, like 90 degrees Fahrenheit, to ensure that the air temperature was perfect and that the conditions were right for the puppet. And Frank Oz didn't even want to be a puppeteer, man.
No,
really?
That's the interesting thing.
Frank Oz would actually go on to a very successful directorial career, including What About Bob, which I know is a family favorite of yours, Jonathan.
Yeah, that is one of those endlessly quotable films,
Bill
and
Murray,
probably one of Bill
genius.
Murray's best films.
So, I mean, ultimately, the Great Muppet Caper is this amazing just accumulation of everything that makes the Muppets great. And Jim Henson's very first directorial debut. And he would go on to do something almost the exact opposite of it next. Almost the exact opposite. And it wouldn't be a Muppet podcast if I didn't just go ahead and say, here's your transition into the Dark Crystal, Alex. There you go.
Yeah. I see it right here in the script. Thank you.
I like the phrase "very first directorial debut," as if you can have a second directorial debut.
All right,
I mean,
go ahead
if we're
and
going
cut
to talk
that
about
down.
his second directorial debut, then we're going to be talking about The Dark Crystal from 1982. So The Dark Crystal from 1982 is Jim Henson's attempt to break away from the Muppets and at the same time create his own fantasy world in which he can operate and really kind of just experiment with the form that puppets can bring. And this is
Alex, if I could just bring up, it's important to note that how the Dark Crystal got its start, Jim Henson was very interested in this fantasy illustrator, Brian Froud, who did these really detailed and dark, complex art characters. And he basically saw these and he was so interested in it. And he was like, you know what? I want to bring that art to life. I want to see if I can make this a living, tangible thing with my knowledge of puppetry.
So kind of like how H.R. Geiger kind of was the impetus for Alien being the way that it is.
Absolutely. So I cannot understate the importance of Brian Froud, who would later also work as the creative director on The Labyrinth as well.
Yeah,
So-
yeah, and going even farther back, the idea for before it became the Dark Crystal, it was just the crystal. So it literally got darker, both thematically and in terms of the title from the series of Muppet
Yes.
movies. But going back to the idea for the crystal, Jim Henson was stuck at JFK Airport, which I can relate to. I've never been stuck there for 3 days, but him and his daughter were stuck there for 3 days, and they crashed in a hotel near the airport where they were snowed in, and they came up with the idea for the crystal, which eventually became the Dark Crystal when he sees these illustrations, and later on would become this movie, this film. And it tells the story of a world basically out of harmony.
Another world, another time. In the age of wonder, 1,000 years ago, this land was green and good, until the crystal cracked. For a single piece was lost, a shard of the crystal. Then strife began, and 2 new races appeared, the cruel Skeksis, the gentle mystics. Thank you. My name is Hayden Chauffe, number 23, and that was Dark Crystal.
Yes, so we have the Mystics and the Skeksis, who we see throughout the film. The Skeksis seem to rule this land somehow. They are big.
The land is Thraw, by the way. It's never mentioned in the film, but it's Thraw.
Oh, I was about to say I didn't think it had a name. But there you go. They seem to rule the land. They have an army of bugs at their command. And both them and the bugs are ugly and nasty and vile and cruel to their subjects, who they kidnap and suck the life force out of in an attempt to drink their life force so they can stay younger. So the Skeksis are terrified of Gelflings. They have had all of them killed, or so they think, because there is one left. He is living with the Mystics. He's been raised by the Mystics. He was saved as a young kid after his entire village and his family was killed. He's been raised by the Mystics, and as the main mystic who's been raising him is dying, he tells him, I think he says the words "chosen one." I don't know. But even if he doesn't say the words,
he does.
That trope is definitely there. He is definitely the chosen one.
This is unapologetically just the chosen one's journey.
Fantasy genre to the max.
Correct.
Yeah, which is probably a good thing because you're asking a big leap of faith from the audience to dive into a fantasy world that is made up entirely of puppets with no human actors. So giving them those strong fantasy tropes to latch onto as an entry point into the story is a really solid idea. But anyway, so Jin sets off on his quest. He's been told he's the chosen one by the mystic who raised him, who then dies. And then we see the Skeksis Emperor die at the same time. Hint, hint, and wink, wink.
At first, I thought that was just poetry, and I kind of wish.
I think that it's intentional too. Yeah. Well, I mean, you kind of get it the second time they do it. It's like, boy, someone just doesn't burst into flames while walking across a canyon for no reason. That's
not a coincidence. But anyway, Jin sets off on his quest. He meets Ahura, who gives him the crystal shard, and they are then promptly attacked by these big bug creatures who work for the Skeksis. And the Skeksis...
The Gartham.
The Gartham. The Gartham get Ahura and take her off, but Jin now has the crystal shard, and he is going to use it to save the world by using it to heal the dark crystal itself. And as he continues on his journey, he meets Kira, who is also a Gelfling, but she is a Gelfling female, which means she has wings. And they continue along their quest. They go see the Podling village where Kira was raised, which is then promptly attacked by the Gartham.
Yes.
And they escape yet again. And then they set off on these landwalkers, which it took me a while to realize were just like people in costumes on stilts, like both hand and leg stilts.
It was an interesting story because they kind of did a lot of tests with these creatures. Like there was a huge pre-production of this film where they were just experimenting. And they knew that they wanted these creatures that they could travel on, to move fast, but they were having so much trouble with the puppetry, like getting something that works. So eventually they brought in, the thing that they did that was really smart was they brought in a lot of recruited groups of like dancers and acrobats and clowns. And basically they came up with this idea of essentially a person being like, almost like a hunched over on these stilts. So basically their hands are attached to stilts and their legs are attached to stilts, and they're being propped up by the stilts. And it allows for this really incredible effect where they can run at really fast pace.
Well, we're going to have to talk about the fact that this entire movie was redubbed at one point.
Talk about completely different world. Like the goal of this was so much, let's create a fantasy world that no one has ever seen before that is completely alien to our own world. And it was so much so at first that they had completely had a complete language made up that was kind of based in Greek and Egyptian origins to create
both the Skeksis and the mystics to speak. So you wouldn't understand what they were saying. They would just be speaking this mystical language.
And it really did not resonate well with the audiences because what Jim really wanted, he wanted the film to be so visual that you kind of would have to make the assumptions based off of intuition on what they were saying. And it was done in such a way that I think if you really focused, you could do that, but audiences weren't really willing to do that. So the first thing that they did is they just gave it subtitles, but they realized that wouldn't work. So then they just went back and dubbed over it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I feel bad for the guy who had to come up with the redubbed dialogue. Apparently he holed up in a hotel for like a week with a videotape of the movie thus far to read the lips of the Skeksis and the Mystics as they were performed and try to come up with dialogue that would make sense in the story and match their lips at the same time.
But yeah, I've watched the version because the version does exist on the DVD. They give you the version with the made up language, and it's really surreal watching it. It's so cool. It's not like anything else.
Yeah,
and it's kind of a shame that they had to. I mean, they had to have a little Hollywood moment where the audiences weren't going for it.
So anyway, Kira and Jin take off on these land walkers along with Fizzgig. Don't forget Fizzgig.
Yes.
And they save some of the podlings that are about to be taken into the castle of the Skeksis. And of course, this entire time, the Mystics have been walking towards this castle. And we see one of them drop dead randomly, and we see the other one burst into flame. And the Skeksis are
strangely in time with another creature when they die.
as some of the Skeksis themselves die. And we're getting the sense that these are connected in some way, but we don't know what way yet. The Skeksis are having their own little internal court dispute over who's going to be the next emperor, and they do weird Skeksis things, including kicking or forcing one of them out, like outcasting, that's banishing one of them. And they strip all of the clothes off the Skeksis. And let me tell you that one of the things I was not expecting or not wanting to see when I started this movie was a naked Skeksis. And I saw that. And oh my gosh, that's not pleasant. But
I mean, the Skeksis are just not pleasant to begin with.
It's true. It's very true. I mean, it's incredibly fitting. But it was like, wow, I didn't think this could get worse. And it did.
And that scene, by the way, has incredible puppetry, especially when you consider each of the Skeksis require several puppeteers to perform. So all those Skeksis piling on, disrobing the Chamberlain, there was like literally a sea of people like bumped up against each other, like 20, 30 people. It's ridiculous. Walking over wires, because a lot of the eyes and different components of the puppets are controlled through radio wires and some remote control stuff.
Yeah. So Jin and Kira get to the castle, and once they are at the castle, they go through a bunch of trials and tribulations, which I don't want to dive too deeply into at the moment, because it's not necessary. And eventually they reach the final confrontation where, are we just going to spoil this? I think we are. I think we're at that point.
Don't tell me they heal the crystal.
They heal the crystal. But can you guess what happens next?
Well, I mean, was it heavily hinted throughout the entire film?
It might have been. If you guessed that the Skeksis and the Mystics were two halves of the same coin, then you are or two sides of the same coin, then you are correct. They were. It turns out that they were one super race at one point called the Skeksis, which are like these big glowing things that look like sky jellyfish.
They're literally, if you go to the some of the source material, they're literally just aliens.
Yeah.
And it's amazing. And they look like aliens too. It's a really...
Yeah, it's almost like straight out of like a 60s sci-fi kind of thing.
It was you know what it reminded me of? The and this is going to sound really weird and stupid. The end scene of Crystal Skull, where you get to the end and it's like, oh, it's aliens.
Aliens.
And plus it also has the crystal in the title, but one of these is a much better film. It's the Dark Crystal, spoilers. So anyway, it turns out they were the same alien. They were the same beings the entire time. They had done something stupid in the past to cause the crystal to break apart and their essences to split. And by putting them back together, they have now been healed. And now peace and harmony can return to the land, except for all of those people who are dead. Sorry that you are dead now.
Peace and harmony return to like 4 people.
Yeah, to those who are left. But now let's talk about the making of the Dark Crystal and the techniques involved in it, because it was not an easy film to make in any way, shape, or form. It was very complicated. Like you mentioned, Hayden, there were like 20 or 30 people working each Skeksis. We mentioned that you had to
or not each Skeksis. Like there were about 2 to 3 people per Skeksis. Yeah. But in that scene,
you need more people to work at. Essentially, what we're saying is you need many more people to work at Skeksis than you need to work Kermit the Frog.
Correct.
So we're stepping up in complexity here from the Great Muppet Caper. There's a lot more animatronics involved with remote radio controlled Muppets. I don't even know if animatronics is the right word, but
there were some animatronic stuff. I know that.
Yeah. And there's some really interesting wide shots in this film that I am still confuzzled by, Hayden, and you might know how they did it. There are some scenes where it's just a wide shot and you see Jen like running, like legitimately running, and it looks like a person running.
Alex, you want the most interesting story ever?
Yes,
it is a person running who was. Yes, it really. For some of the wide shots, they had a body double that they would use.
The puppet got a double.
It did. And then they would jump back to him on the close-ups. Then they would use a combination of marionette stuff. Of course, they would have a standard hand puppet that was interestingly operated by Jim Henson. And one thing that this was the first film where they didn't actually use the voices of the puppeteers. Some rare cases they did. Like Steve Whitmire was one of the Skeksis, and his voice worked well enough that they kept it. And because they didn't want people recognizing their voices, they wanted them really to be emerged.
Yeah, but this is and we've talked about this a little bit already in the podcast, but Jim Henson really thought of himself as this artist who liked to push the boundaries, liked to innovate, liked to do weird things and find really interesting ways to express himself. And the Dark Crystal is definitely, I mean, just the whole idea of a Muppet movie is indulging in that tendency. But the Dark Crystal is really going farther out away from the mainstream than the Muppet movie did, or the Muppet films did. So, and lets him get into this experimental art side of him that he really liked to express and explore.
So it really harkens back to the primary concept of Dark Crystal, which was, usually when someone creates a film, it starts with the plot, right? So what the character wants, the obstacles that are facing their way. This world, this film was based entirely on the idea of, let's create this incredibly detailed world and then build a story around it, which was something that no one had really done before, was create the world first and then add the components later. And what it leads to is a world that has insane levels of detail. Like I guess we can talk about this a little bit more towards the end, but they are actually creating a Netflix series, The Dark Crystal Age of Resistance, and it's going to be amazing because they have so much, because Brian Froud is actually working on it again, who of course was the primary artistic visual creator of this film.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in terms of the world building, the thing that I kept thinking of as we were going through these scenes where Jen is like walking through this forest and every little like creature that comes up and the trees that move and like all of these different elements that they bring up, it's so fleshed out. And honestly, like I may get some flack for this comparison, but it reminded me a lot of Avatar and the way that
same here.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, because that like. As weak as the story of Avatar is, the world building and the creature creations is definitely where a lot of the time in that movie was spent. And that's kind of what you were talking about, Hayden, where, you know, this world was built and then a story was kind of put into it. And that's kind of, I guess, the same situation that happened for both of these films. And I think we can admit that in both of those films, the story is definitely weaker than the technical artistry that went into them, because whatever you think of Avatar, it was a beautiful and well-executed creation. And it's just seeing that done on a physical level where everything has been handmade by people and it was shot on film. And the other one is more digitally created, where these things were invented and crafted on a computer. But it's kind of coming in the same vein and gives you the same, a similar kind of watching experience of just like seeing these really cool things. And it really kind of sparks your imagination to these different kinds of worlds and stuff like that.
Absolutely. Just the immersion that comes from knowing that every little detail has been created so meticulously and there's a reason for everything. Really gets you invested in the film, even though the story may not be the strongest, kind of this cliche hero prophecy kind of foray with kind of a twist ending.
And one of those details that I really liked, and then I saw Jim Henson talking about it in one of these interviews as one of his favorite details, is these little bugs that not the big scary bugs, but these little ones that kind of crawl around on the floor whenever they go into a hallway, and they actually like serve them as dessert to some of the Skeksis.
The crawlers.
Yeah, these little crawler things, which are basically little fuzzballs that kind of fly around, and they're just like little things that kind of just scurry around on the floor, but they're just like, they add this extra sense of life. And apparently they were actually like little dollar store wind-up toys that I guess they put some fur on and would just like set them loose, but they really like the way that they shoot it and just kind of sprinkle them into the scenes. They feel real, and they just give this extra sense of life and detail to this world that's been created.
Yeah, and something we should definitely mention with the Dark Crystal before we get into Labyrinth is this idea of whether or not puppets are for kids. And if you'd ask Jim Henson, he would say, no, they're for everybody. And he strongly resisted being identified as a kid's entertainer for most of his career, except when he was like, let's make Fraggle Rock. Let's make a kid show.
Well, Fraggle Rock was about literally trying to trying to create world peace in the entire world.
Yeah.
Which is insane.
Work, but
I mean, yeah, if anything.
Did we mention this was the 80s?
Yes.
Yes. But it was explicitly made as a kid show. And that's it's something that I think he thought the Muppets had a stigma for a very long time of being just for kids, because in America before Jim Henson came around, Muppets were thought of as only kids entertainment, whereas in Europe it was a very traditional art form that almost everybody would go see. And at least that's what Jim Henson found out when he did a few tours of Europe in his younger days. But he would always say that the Muppets were for everybody. And if you take a look at the Dark Crystal, it would be hard to call this a kid's film. I mean, maybe family film.
I think, family entertainment.
It's approved for all audiences, but it's not like a kiddie film by any stretch of the imagination.
Well,
it's very mature.
That was one of the genius parts of Jim Henson. He would never talk down to children. He realized the importance of treating children with respect, and the fact that they really are just adults in the making. He wasn't afraid to incorporate really deep philosophical and emotional themes within his work. In darkness too. There are some immensely terrifying dark scenes in the Dark Crystal, especially, and I don't think he shied away from it. I think he realized the importance of, children can handle these things, and maybe give them a little bit of fear, and isn't such a bad thing.
And again, all of these like creatures and just like world building is just kind of fertile ground for a child's imagination. When you're that young and you're seeing these things that aren't real, you're not looking for the ways that it was made. You're just like, imagining it and putting as much reality into these images as possible. I mean, there are things that I've gone back and watched that I thought were just the most amazingly well put together things when I was a kid, and then I look at them, I'm like, oh wow, that's so like cheesy or poorly animated or poorly put together. But the way the more reality you can put into it, the more you can feed a child's imagination, and that is definitely something that Jim Henson did really well.
Yeah, and we should talk about and this is something that comes up a lot in the podcast over several episodes, is the idea that we have 2017 eyes. We live in a world inundated with CGI and really good animation everywhere. And 1982 wasn't that at all. There's animation if you look at Walt Disney. But yeah, the visual style was very different than anything you had seen before. And, since computers really developed in and after the 80s to get to the point where you had something like Pixar springing up and computer animation became a thing and CGI became a practical way to make fantasy happen. puppets weren't really seen as a practical solution. So you didn't get a lot that came after The Dark Crystal, as just kind of a standalone debut attempt at making this, from the ground up fantasy film. Then it really, it's more impressive than you think it is.
Speaking of childhood imagination and the road to becoming an adult, Jonathan, would you like to talk about the next and final film that Jim Henson made?
Guide us through this maze of a film, Jonathan.
Yes, so I will be your fawn today. Oh, sorry, wrong Labyrinth. So yeah, talking about the last film.
Pan on over to the world of Jim Henson.
There you go, thank you. Talking about Labyrinth from 1986. This film is now incorporating creatures and people together into a film to create a fantasy world, and draws very heavily on kind of fairy tales and like some very specific references to things like The Wizard of Oz and Escher's paradoxical illustrations in Alice in Wonderland.
Very specific reference to MC Escher. Very specific.
Yeah. And
and just generically throughout the whole design of the film.
That's true.
Right. I think she literally has books of all of that stuff. Like we do a pan of her room, and it has just, all the things. It just totally sets up the whole movie, kind of in the way that we talked about with Steven Spielberg in our very first episode, how in the very first scene of a film, he will essentially give you a little mini rundown of what you can expect for the rest of the film, which is what happens here, where we start with our main character, Sarah. She's rehearsing her lines for a play, something along the lines of, I have come all this way to the Goblin Castle to give me my child back. But she can't get the lines right. There's something. She keeps getting blocked mentally. And then it starts raining, so she goes inside, and her evil stepmother, hint, hint, basically makes her stay home and watch the baby, and she's super upset. And then she says the magic words, I wish the goblins would take my baby away. And then David Bowie comes and takes her baby away. And
her baby brother.
Yeah, sorry, her
not
baby
her
brother.
Actual baby.
Not her real baby. She ends up at the entrance to this labyrinth, and David Bowie gives her 13 hours because he has a clock with an extra hour for whatever reason. And he's like, if you could get to the castle in 13 hours, I'll give you your brother back. So then she starts doing this labyrinth and meets a lot of quirky characters, all of whom are some kind of animatronic or, a person in a creature suit, or just like basically every different kind of way that Jim Henson had learned how to make creatures. He creates these characters using, and
this is both like a thematic accumulation of Jim Henson's work, but also a technological accumulation of his work. Because some of the techniques that they use, just specifically, they like Hoggle, he operates using 5 people. So you have a person in the suit, and then you have...
Hoggle being this little gnome character that she meets at the beginning, who sort of helps her through, but also is sort of working for David Bowie. But yeah, so there's that character, and then there is
Ludo,
who is a big I don't even know what to call him.
Monster.
Yeah,
I mean,
he's
kind
a
of like a troll-ish kind of character in fur. Sir Didymus.
Yeah, Sir Didymus, who's kind of like a fox, who also is kind of like a medieval knight, and
he rides on his
squirrel. Anyway,
I got kind of Yorkshire Terrier kind of vibes, like a dog.
Yeah, he's ambiguous. So basically, these are the main characters, and they meet different villain characters and just quirky kind of riddle characters, and they very much in the sense of Alice in Wonderland, where she comes up to different situations. Some of the characters help her, some of them confuse or obstruct her, all the way till she gets to the end where she confronts David Bowie, and then where we end the film on a did it happen, was it her imagination kind of a thing. So you were talking about Hoggle, because he's this little like I said, he's kind of like a gnome or
like a
goblin.
like a garden gnome, but kind of a little darker, a little more edgier.
So I wasn't
Edgy.
sure if he was one of these things where, it's like a little person in a suit with a mask on, or if he was some kind of puppeteered character.
So the answer, Jonathan, may surprise you both. So there was an actress who would serve as the physical movement of Hoggle. So she was basically wearing a giant costume of Hoggle. But besides that, there were also 4 puppeteers. And Hoggle was arguably one of the most complex puppets they had done up to that point. Because his face had so many different, almost 80 different motors within it.
Wow.
All controlling these little details in his expression. So the primary puppeteer who did the voice, who actually and kept the voice, was actually Jim Henson's son, Brian Henson. This character was so complex that it required 5 different performers working in complete synchronization with each other, which required an astonishing amount of rehearsal time, which is really the huge triumph of that character.
The other characters, so Ludo, I mean, that was just a guy in a big suit, right?
Yes, it was. And the interesting thing about Ludo is they had done a lot of full-body Muppets before, but this was probably one of the most complex full-body Muppets, and it was immensely heavy at first. So one of the big challenges with Ludo was figuring out how to make the fabric and the materials as high quality, but also as light as possible. And what they ended up doing was, because the bodysuit was so heavy, I think it weighed about 70 pounds.
Yeah, because it was just all fur, just a bunch of fur.
They actually had 2 performers for Ludo that would swap out so they could continue to film. And basically, that was another challenge of Ludo, was making it so basically they can pop one performer out, bring in the next one. And of course, also, that character also has a lot of complex eye and facial movements going on.
Yeah, that kind of mask reminds me a lot of one of the other, I guess, creature builds that we've talked about on the podcast before, which is, of all things, the King Kong from 1976.
Where
gosh. We talked
Not that
about
movie again.
I know, but we talked about how many masks they built for King Kong and all the different animatronics and rotors and stuff. So that is kind of leading up to probably Jim Henson perfecting all of those techniques, and he was so particular about the little tiny movements. And I don't remember that King Kong being an especially graceful animatronic, but all of these characters that Jim Henson creates have so many little details. Like I remember that, like, the first scene of Dark Crystal, just to go back for a second, all the Skeksis are staring at the crystal and the beams are going into their eyes, and they're static, but they have these little, like, breathing, like, gill movements in their necks and in their cheeks and stuff. And it was just like that close attention to detail just immediately lets you believe in these characters right away. And the same thing goes for all of these characters. And
the ensemble of talent of these puppeteers is immense. He gathered the best of the best.
And then going into the smallest of our main characters, with what's his name?
Sir Didymus.
Sir Didymus. And he's closer to some of the things that they did in Dark Crystal, right?
Correct. He was actually closer to even a Muppet, I would say, because there were the primary performer, we've talked about him a little bit, was Dave Goelz, who did Gonzo and did Fizzgig and a few others. He would do there were actually several versions of Sir Didymus. So they would obviously, like we were talking about with the Great Muppet Caper, they would have a hand puppet for the close-up shots, but then they would also have radio-controlled puppets for when he was riding on Ambrosius. And even they went as far as to create versions of Didymus that would have completely different expressions that they would swap out during scenes. So when he was a little more angry or a little more, what's the word? Flamboyant, I guess. Indignant. They would be able to express a huge range of emotions.
So I have a couple questions for you, Hayden.
Go ahead.
The first is, because these aren't Muppets, these are creatures. So what's the difference between a Muppet and a creature? And the second is, how did they get that one puppet to look so much like David Bowie?
All right, I'm going to take these questions one at a time. I don't think I could take them any other way. So the difference between a creature and a Muppet. A Muppet specifically deals with the characters in the universes of The Muppet Show, Fraggle Rock, and Sesame Street. All of those characters pertaining to that show are Muppets. And Muppets, generally speaking, are a lot more idealistic and simplistic in their execution. They're usually made of softer foams versus the creatures, which are, we talk about stuff from The Dark Crystal, The Labyrinth, Jim Henson's Storyteller series. They were made with more complex and intricate designs. They had a lot more radio controls. We were just talking about how Hoggle had over 80 motors in his face. And basically, they were made using a huge assortment of materials. Some were foam, like specifically what comes to mind, the door knockers. They were made just completely out of foam, and then a type of foam that made them resemble bronze, but really they're just foam. But it's incredible the kind of techniques they were able to pull off with all the different combinations. But they used a lot of latex. They used a lot of different mechanisms, and bone structure was especially important with characters like Ludo. Generally, the Muppets don't really... The puppeteer very much forms the structure. Okay,
and what about the David Bowie thing?
Oh, yes. The David Bowie puppet was one of their most elaborate projects. It's interesting.
Didn't David Bowie write all the songs?
David Bowie wrote all the songs, and to this date, I have no idea what any of them are actually saying. I don't think anyone does. It's just a lot of vowels.
The power of voodoo.
Yes, hoodoo.
Yeah, they're really catchy.
They are. They're very
completely nonsense, but very catchy.
No, I think that kind of goes back to Jim Henson being a creative person who liked to let his guest stars be creative. On the Muppet Show, he would kind of like sit down with the star that week and be like, okay, what do you want to do? Like if they were a person who was a comedian who wanted to do dramatic things, he'd let them do that. If they were if they played the straight man all the time, then they could be a comedian on the show. And he kind of just let people who wanted to do something creative do it. He didn't manhandle their creativity in any sort of way. And when he asked David Bowie to be in the movie, he also asked him to write all the songs, and he definitely kind of just let him do it. I mean, heck, going back to the Muppet Show again, there's even stories of him, or not the Muppet Show. What is it? Hayden, you might have to help me out here, but there's stories of him asking a composer to create songs for either the show or one of the movies. And he said, and they were like, don't you want to hear him first? And he was like, no, I'll hear him on set.
Was that Paul Williams with the original Muppet movie?
I think it was.
I kind of do. So we talked about the like main characters, but are there any like standouts as far as the creation of some of the side characters? Because she meets so many interesting characters, like the little caterpillar worm with a scarf that definitely recalls Alice in Wonderland, and the lying doorman and the door knockers. But are there any like ones that really stand out or have interesting tidbits?
Yeah, absolutely. And let me just talk about a few of them, kind of rapid fire. The worm. The interesting thing about the worm is the worm had two different puppets. So basically they had the 1-inch like remote controlled puppet where basically
like actual size
for
the wide shot.
And then they had literally a full body regular worm puppet. Well, regular hand puppet. Full body is not the right word for that. Karen Perel would perform the hand version puppet of it, which was like a full size, like a Kermit puppet, essentially. So they would go back and forth and then superimpose Sarah into the shots with the full body, and then kind of use a lot of different camera jumps to kind of sew the whole scene together. Another really interesting group of characters, the Fireys. They didn't actually do it on green screen. They did it completely on black screen. Basically, they had performers completely draped out in black, performing against a black background. And they had performers performing the heads, performers performing the torsos. And some of the things that they pulled off with these characters are ridiculous. Like some of the more complex shots, like the Fiery literally pulling out his eyes.
Oh, yeah.
And then rolling them snake eye and saying snake eyes. That was one of the shots that took a tremendous amount of work to get right and to get believable. But essentially, Labyrinth kind of is this whole coming of age story for this this teenager, and kind of each of the characters kind of embodies this different component of her psyche, and kind of the uncomfortable nature of going through puberty and kind of dealing with all these different temptations. Specifically, David Bowie's character, the Goblin King, who is kind of this embodiment of evil and temptation and going down the wrong path, and the allure of that. It's interesting that they chose to make David Bowie so alluring in like this kind of rock star character, because it really shows how difficult it can be sometimes when you're going through all these different emotions when you're growing as a young woman, how to deal with those. And all of these characters kind of form a different component of her psyche. Like, some of the more obvious ones, kind of like the junk lady, how at the beginning of the film, she is really concerned about one of her toys being taken away. And then we have this whole component of her fears of materialism. And then we have literally her fears in general with Hoggle, and kind of her ignorance and innocence with Ludo. So yeah, it's interesting how this whole thing can kind of double as this giant allegory. Just the creativity and thought-provoking power that something can have when you transform all these concepts and ideas into physical characters.
All right, let's slide on over into overall notes. And we've already talked about a lot. Jim Henson's predilection for technical innovation, and his kind of self-identity as an experimental artist over being like a kids performer. Like he was a guy for everybody, for adults and kids, who liked to push the boundaries and liked to be an experimental artist. And he was just as likely to be found thinking up a new Muppet gag as he was to be thinking up some crazy experimental thing like Timepiece.
And then one of the other things that we've kind of mentioned already, but like we talked about with a lot of directors, Jim Henson is definitely one of those that has his group of artists that he's very comfortable with and did a lot of work with over the span of his career, most notably Frank Oz, who was definitely his partner in crime as far as directing and performing and just pretty much everything creative for a good chunk of his career.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, no doubt there were, Jerry Jewell and Dave Goles and all these other people were huge. Don Salon, who was like the primary puppet builder for the Muppets for a long time. It was always such a huge collaborative, creative ensemble. And everyone always felt like they were contributing. The environment that Jim Henson created, this kind of environment that anything goes. And let's try to go to a place as weird and as crazy as we could possibly go, and then have lunch afterwards. Was incredible. And in one of primary relationships between him and Frank was really kind of the heart of the Muppets, and it was embodied in their characters, of course, their duos that that everyone knows about, but also kind of their ideologies as well. Jim, who was always very focused on, go further, let's make this impossible technological achievement. Let's build worlds that no one has ever been to. The artistry and the imagery of it was very much Jim. And then Frank was very much, let's explore these characters. There was the quote about the O'Neill play, let's make these characters as deep as possible. So it's almost like Jim was very much about expansive, going as far as you can. And then Frank was very much about this kind of the subtlety, the character relationships, things like that. And they overlapped too, which made them just this incredible team. And it's why the Muppet films and the Dark Crystal and some of the other things are so successful, because you have that sense of camaraderie that is powerful.
So Hayden, I have a question for you.
Go ahead, Alex.
The last Muppet movie came out in 2014, and their
Correct.
TV show that ran for a little while and was canceled after one season. So what are the Muppets doing? What do the Muppets do? Do they just sit in a closet for most of the time, or do they have shows?
Well, when they're not being used, they do sit in a closet, they sit in a box. After Jim Henson passed away in 1990, they continued to develop movies. A lot of the films that a lot of people hold dear in their hearts were actually made post Jim Henson. So Muppet Christmas Carol, Muppet Treasure Island, the Muppets Go to Space, which was in 2000. And then after that, there was a second reboot of the series. They didn't really go away anywhere. They were still doing TV specials like the Muppets Wizard of Oz and things like that. But the big reboot in 2011 of the Muppets was really what brought them back into prominence. And then they had the follow-up of Muppets Most Wanted, which, in my opinion, is an amazing film. But it didn't do quite as well as the original 2011 reboot. But after that, of course, they tried out they went back to ABC and they did a new television show. Essentially, it was a different take for the Muppets. It was a lot more adult, and it kind of lost a lot of the components that make the Muppets so compelling, like the sense of anarchy, the sense of whimsy and just creative. They kind of just made them they kind of just made The Office with Muppets, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. And it was, sometimes the show was hilarious, but it wasn't quite as true to the original Jim Henson vision, which is not to say the Muppets haven't always been about appealing to a wide audience, both children and adults. But the most recent thing that the Muppets have done, actually this year, was they did a live stage show performance at the Hollywood Bowl in California, which a lot of this stuff is really strong. And I think they're finding this new group of performers that have taken over the Muppets. Some of the originals are still there, specifically Dave Goelz. This new team is really starting to figure out what makes the Muppets tick. So I'm really excited to see what's in store for the Muppets specifically in the future.
And aside from the Muppet characters themselves, like Jim Henson's studio still exists and still does a lot of character work, but how does that express itself? What kinds of things does the Jim Henson workshop work on?
They're actually planning on rebooting the Dark Crystal with a new series on Netflix called The Dark Crystal Age of Resistance, which is, and the really exciting thing about that is Brian Froud, who we talked about during Dark Crystal and Labyrinth, is heading this thing as the head creative designer again. And really, Brian Froud has kind of become an expert in this world, so we should be able to see really intricate and better developed stories now that they kind of have everything on paper and they can really hit it home with some strong story development. So I'm really excited to see what they do with that. Other than that, Jim Henson Company does several cartoons. They do a lot of independent puppet work and independent puppet shows as well. One, for example, Puppet Up, which is kind of like this gritty improv puppet show that was created by Brian Henson. And it's basically a series of improv scenes with puppets, and they're kind of more raunchy, kind of resembling what the Muppets were like when the cameras weren't rolling in between takes. There would be a lot of sass and, things they couldn't obviously get away with on a family show. And Brian Henson loved that component of it, and he was like, you know what, let's make an improv show based off of that premise.
Yeah, so one of the interesting kind of themes of Jim Henson's life that I discovered or noticed as I was doing research this week was how much time he had to spend over the course of his career. One, looking for funding for projects, and two, looking for people to show his projects. Because the way he was doing puppets was so unconventional and so groundbreaking. Not that people didn't like it, but that people didn't think it would work in an adult audience time slot, or that it would be a profitable return on their money. And he spent a lot of time worrying about that. And that's one of the reasons he eventually went to Disney, was he thought it would give him the creative freedom to just do things without having to worry about finding a place to air it or finding a place to fund it. And if Jim Henson was born today or reincarnated today as he might have thought would happen, I don't know. He had very very open beliefs in a lot of things. But if he was around today and he was trying to do the same thing, but if he was trying to do the same thing today, he would just throw it up on YouTube. He could just get a camera from the store for not that much money, go home, get some puppets, put it up on YouTube. And if it was great, his characters are great as they were then, he would explode, and he could do whatever he wanted with the creative freedom that YouTube and the internet in general offers. And there's a lot of potential in that.
Symbolically and physically explode, by the way.
Yes. Yeah, very much so. And I think it's a good lesson to take a look at. One, because I like imagining what ifs. Like, what if Jim Henson had YouTube available to him? What crazy things would he be able to cook up? Would he be able to make something like Dark Crystal over and over and over again until the point where he had it nailed and was doing really great puppet fantasy work? Would he be able to achieve that? But also, too, just to all those aspiring creators out there, don't take the time we live in and the technology and the platforms available for granted. There is a lot in your court that there wasn't 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago for aspiring creators. Look at all that Jim Henson had to go through to get on TV. He spent 2 decades trying to get at until he finally got the Muppet Show to reach an audience that was worldwide. And now you just put it up online and it's good enough. And if it hits the right algorithm, you can have millions of people looking at your thing. And as Kermit says in the original Muppet movie, you have the chance at making millions of people happy, making millions of people smile. And that's really incredible. And for as much crap as I think we give YouTube these days for doing some of the dumb stuff they do, and to be fair, they do a lot of dumb stuff, I think we need to as aspiring creators out there, I think we should not take what we have available to us for granted.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, kind of asking that what if question, it's also kind of interesting to see some of the success stories that kind of mirror the way that Jim Henson was creating and stuff like that. So 2 examples that I can think of off the top of my head is a YouTube creator named Chris Kendall, who had created this little short film called Oscar's Hotel, where he basically just had this one character who was a a hotel clerk, and he would open these doors and cut to himself in a different costume, making these fun characters. And Vimeo ended up seeing this and funded him to create a 6-episode web series, which actually used the Jim Henson Company to help him create his creature costumes and character designs and stuff like that.
That series is so fantastically absurd. It's great.
It is. It's really it's right along the same kind of lines of ridiculous humor. And that's almost like exactly what you're talking about, Alex, where this kid had an idea, put it on YouTube, got the right eyes on it, and got funded to make his crazy vision when maybe a normal like studio wouldn't. And another thing that I was thinking of that is a little bit bigger scale, but you know, a kid who had some puppets and created a thing that ended up blowing up is Joel Hodgson, who created Mystery Science Theater by basically creating these these little characters in his bedroom and silhouetted himself and made fun of old movies, and the right person saw it, and he created a series that ran for 12 seasons and is now being rebooted again
on
Netflix. And
again, the reboot's really good.
Yeah, so it's I mean, exactly what you're talking about. That actually does happen. YouTube is this force that overcomes barriers that have been practically insurmountable in the past. And you know how much time Jim Henson spent trying to get his creations in front of the right eyes. It's completely different landscape from that point of view these days.
Yeah,
definitely an exciting time to be alive for creators.
Yeah, and we're not saying that YouTube is perfect, obviously, and we're not saying that the barriers aren't still there, but they're lower, and they're different than what they were a while ago. So let this be your motivational Tuesday message for you.
I'm seriously motivated. I'm gonna go make some art.
And let's hope you're as happy as Henson would want you to be.
All right, so on that happy motivational note, let's talk about the films that we're going to talk about next week. So next week, we're talking about a specific genre, and that is science fiction, which we're going to talk about in a more generic sense than some of the specific directors and things who have made films in the sci-fi genre. And our little through line next week will be aliens throughout the ages. And we're going to start with The Day the Earth Stood Still, the old one from 1951, not the Keanu Reeves one. And E.T. from 1982, Steven Spielberg. Actually, the first time Spielberg has been on the podcast since episode 1, I believe. And finally, Arrival from last year. And so, yeah, there should be lots of good conversation about the different ways that aliens have been portrayed throughout the ages. And for the most part, these are fairly non-violent aliens. So that'll be another dimension to this whole thing.
Yeah, it should be a good episode. It should be out of this world. Really looking forward to covering that next week.
And also check out our Twitter, because we are running a poll for the week following, which will be about documentaries, another genre that we haven't talked about at all, and we wanted to get it in before the end of season 1, which will be at the end of December. And so this is going to be a different kind of poll. We are going to throw up 4 film titles. Vote for your favorite, and we will do the top 3 on the podcast.
And hopefully there won't be like a 3-time over tie this time.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Hayden, for joining us on the podcast.
I was happy to be here, like the title. But seriously, just being able to share how much Jim Henson and the Muppets mean to me, it was a great pleasure. I think Jim Henson brought such a tremendous sense of joy and humor and creativity to the world, which I think you guys are doing an amazing job of as well on this podcast. So I just want to say thank you for having me on again.
And thanks, buddy.
I had a blast.
Yeah, thank you for all your insight. Definitely gives us a more full view of the work of Jim Henson, which I don't know that either I or Alex had known quite so much before this week.
I'm glad I got to get some of that out.
We are very fortunate to have a mega Henson fan so close to us. So that is brilliant. But that is about all the time we have for this episode.
If you have movie suggestions for us or just want to reach out, I can be found on Twitter at @JSSatchel.
And I'm at Alex Garinger.
And I'm at Hayden Chauffe.
And to find links to things that we talked about today, you can view them on the blog at thefilmlings.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next week.
All right, see ya. Thanks again, Hayden.
Yeah, thanks, Hayden.
Thank you, guys. That's kind of a huge pet peeve for Muppet fans when people think Cookie Monster has turned into Veggie Monster.
Did that never happen?
Has he not?
There was no. Hold on. Stop. There was one song that Cookie Monster sung about vegetables, and that was it. And if you watch, and now
so what you're
it's
saying
like,
is this is fake news.
It's absolutely fake news. It's absolutely fake news.